We are in week 2 of our teaching series that was honestly born out of a burden, out of a broken heart that I had. We're calling it Irresistible. Subtitle, Recovering the Power of Practicing Grace. I call the series Irresistible because, we are living in a cultural moment where the message of Jesus, the person of Jesus, the message and the power of the church, it's anything but irresistible. It's very resistible. There's a generation of people that are moving away from it, want to have nothing to do with it, either deconverting and sort of evolving past faith, or maybe in a season of deconstruction because of some questions that they have or the pain that they've experienced. And so they're just moving away from church, sort of going beyond it, thinking that was something from our past, that was something from my parents and grandparents. I want to have nothing to do with it. And this is a problem, and this breaks my heart, because if you spend any time with the person of Jesus, as his friends recorded his life in these biographies in our New Testament called the Gospels, you spend any time with this Jesus, you see that people that were nothing like Jesus liked Jesus, and he went after them, and he wanted to spend time with them. And so you see there's this tension in the way that things are today and in the way things were in the first century when Jesus was on the scene, because he seems to be so resistible right now, but that wasn't the case. And there's many different diagnoses for why there's this cultural problem that we're having right now, but I think the main one for me that I want us to tackle to the ground and grow from is this reality right here. That too often people who have been saved by grace are bad at practicing grace. Too often, those who we love to sing and celebrate about the grace of God, we stop it there, and we don't want to be people that actually have that same type of grace and spirit and attitude and posture and presence and power flow out of us. We're just bad at practicing the kind of grace that Jesus practiced and was known for. A couple problems that we discussed last week. I think for many of us in the Western evangelical Christian world that we find ourselves in, we've shrunk grace down to just this theological concept that's like a get out of hell free card. It's thank God that I don't have to be perfect and Jesus loves me and he's given me grace, and then we stop the conversation right there. We think it's just our past to not go to the bad place, but to go to the good place when we die. But last week we discussed that grace is so much more than that. Grace is the power and the presence and the posture of the divine towards humankind. And it's best on display in the person of Jesus. We discussed that grace is so much more than just get out of hell free card. Grace is this. Grace is the power that makes strangers into neighbors and enemies into friends. In a world that was divided and there was not a unity to be found at all, Jesus moved towards people that were nothing like him. And he made people that had all these differences, that they should never be in the same room together. He opened up a seat at his table, and he was always getting in trouble for the people that he would sit at tables with and who he would do life with. It's this radical hospitality and call to friendship. That is grace. And boy, do we need that kind of grace today. Grace is also nothing if it's not forgiveness. Put it this way, that grace holds no record of debts to be repaid. That the power and the presence and the posture of God towards your life and towards all of humanity is forgiveness. And when we talk about forgiveness, I'm not saying that there's never anything like wrong that happens to us and wrongs that are perpetrated towards us. But forgiveness is this beautiful posture of saying that, yes, I'm not going to just like put newspaper over the milk of this mess that you made in my life, but I'm also not going to let this thing define me. I'm not going to let what you did to me live rent-free in my head to bring pain to me. And I'm going to free you and free myself from the gun towards your head of me getting even with you. No debts need to be repaid. Grace is forgiveness. Grace is also this. Grace reaches down to the lowest places to lift people out with no strings attached. Grace flows towards people in their lowest moments, where there's suffering, where there's pain, where there's brokenness, where the world is not the way that God dreamed it to be. And that happens in people's lives physically, in their emotional life. Grace meets them with compassion. saying that I'm going to move towards them to alleviate their suffering. I'm going to give of myself self-sacrificially to do something for them. No strings attached. I just want to lift you out of your suffering. You see how grace is so much more than just I don't go to the bad place when I die. I get to go to the good place. It's so much more than that. And Jesus showed us this. So the first problem is that we've shrunk down grace and we've made it something weaker than what it actually is. Second problem is this, that we have looked at grace and we've seen it as simply a one-way street. Man, there's so much of my life that I have seen grace like this, where we sing songs about God's amazing grace. We get together and we celebrate that we've been saved by grace and all this grace is coming to us, and we stop it there and we see it as a one-way street, not a two-lane highway going back and forth with us breathing in grace and then dispensing grace to our thirsty world. One of Jesus' closest friends, Peter, writing to a group of Jesus followers in the first century, he wrote this and said to the Christ followers in this community, in the ancient world, he said, this is part of your job, you guys. This is what we're called to do. Each of you should use whatever gift you have received from God to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms. You see that part of our role is to receive the gifts from God, the grace from God, and then be middle management to then spread it out and dispense it towards others, to be stewards of it, to manage it well, to give it out in its various forms towards others. This is what we're called to be. And part of our problem is that for too long, Christians have believed grace is just something you receive and you celebrate and you sit on and you wait until you die. But that's not the vision of grace that we're given in our New Testament. It's the posture that we're called to have in our world. It's the presence that we're called to walk into our world to give to others. And last week, if you missed church last week, you missed a good one to come to church because we gave you $55. You can't say that every week, nor can you say that for another 364 days probably. But we did a reverse offering at the end of our service last week if you were here. We actually calculated our average weekly income giving as a church, and then we spread that out over our average weekly adult attendance. And there were everybody got an envelope. All the adults got an envelope with $55 in it. There was only one stipulation. Unless you needed to use these resources for you, just to take care of some basic needs for you, you were called to, you were challenged to, you were invited to find someone to dispense God's grace towards this last week. And man, we had a bunch of beautiful stories roll in about the way that we got to be stewards of God's grace and practice grace this last week. I just want to read a few. We had somebody write in who's a preschool teacher, so there's some preschool teacher language in this, so bear with me. I chose to use mine to purchase items needed to make breakfast and bed bags and take it to school for my cutie pops to share with their mamas. This task helped my littles share their love, appreciation, and compassion and bring a smile to those they love the most, their mamas. Isn't that awesome? I love the multiplying effect of dispensing God's grace. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing. Somebody else wrote this. I met a man downtown paying property taxes. I overheard he owes quite a bit of money by July or his house will be sold in a tax sale. I waited outside after I was done to talk to him, impatiently trying to leave. God kept telling me to be still. I shared the story about the reverse offering at church and how the church gave money to the people instead of asking people for money. And I gave him the envelope. We talked a little bit about God's blessings. We prayed and we cried together. Isn't that meeting somebody in a low moment to be a blessing to them? Somebody else wrote, after the message that Jeff Newton gave a few weeks about helping needy people, and he's talked about the UP program, I decided this is where my reverse offering would go. And I matched the offering, and this will support 3 children in the mini UP program for a whole month. Someone else who's an oncology nurse said, I work as an oncology nurse, and our nurse navigator started a fund for patients who can't afford medications or medical equipment for their home. I gave the reverse offering to help seed that fund. Isn't that beautiful? Another person said this. They were here at church with their granddaughter, Maddie, and Maddie has a very grouchy neighbor next door. The neighbor even called her, let's just say, some not so nice names. On Sunday after church, Maddie decided to go knock on this neighbor lady's door and give her the envelope with the $55 in it. The neighbor lady later came over with a beautiful bouquet of flowers from her backyard and thanked her for the money. She said she really needed the money this month. It softened the neighbor lady's heart. Isn't that awesome? We had a few people that weren't even here in person. They were watching online last week, but they were inspired by the generosity and by dispensing grace into our world. One person said this: I haven't been able to make it to church for a few months because of my health, but I did give my Kroger delivery driver $60 in addition to my tip so I could still be involved in the reverse offering. Isn't that cool? Another person said this: I attend online because my husband isn't well, so I wasn't able to receive the reverse offering last week. I decided to take $55 from our budget and create my own blessing for someone. While I was dropping off items for the Valley of Grace donation at Bridgeway, I noticed that most of the donations so far, including mine, were more about necessities than enjoyables. I went out the next day and used $55 more to buy soft drinks and snacks for them. Isn't that awesome, you guys? People that weren't even here last week. Now, you guys, this is just a taste of what it looks like when God's kingdom breaks into our world. This is a taste of what it looks like when the people of God that are saved by grace practice grace and we become people known for grace. Just a picture of it. Today, what I want to talk about is the when and the where you and I are called to practice grace. The when and the where. Where do we pick our spots? Where do we find our moments to practice grace in our world? And when I was thinking about this and thinking about the way that Jesus did this, it was always during life's hinge moments or like the pivot point moments. You guys know the life's hinge moments, the moments where you like measure all of your life before and then after. And we all have these hinge moments of our life, right? And for me, it's not just when I saw U2 play at the NBA Finals halftime show where the streets have no name when I was in middle school, changed my life forever. It wasn't just that, or it wasn't just when I saw The Dark Knight in IMAX when it was in theaters. Like, if you guys know, you know, it was pretty amazing. But it's not talking about those kind of hinge moments. Like a life hinge moments like when I met my wife, Megan, when we were 16 and 17 years old. Yeah, we were like idiot kids. We met in high school, and I would have never known that like we would now have been on this journey and have a family of 5, and she's just such an incredible partner. When I met Megan, she was actually dating one of my neighbors who was a friend of mine, which I saw as a minor inconvenience to my long-term play, and I won is what happened. And but I would have never thought from that moment being like junior in high school that now, I mean, over half of my life has been with her, and it's changed so much about me and made me so much better. And now as I see her as a mom again, like it is so incredible. It's one of life's hinge moments. Another one of life's hinge moments is when a friend of mine, a mentor of mine, Jason, when I was in college, freshman year, he wanted to meet me at IHOP for breakfast at 7:30 in the morning on a Saturday. It's like the last thing a college freshman wanted to do was go to breakfast at 7:30. Have you ever heard of brunch? Like breakfast at 7:30 on a Saturday? But he sat across the table from me, and I had pancakes on my fork, and he goes, hey, man, I got something I need to tell you. I think that God's calling you into ministry. I think you should be a pastor. And he goes, I think I'm going to be sinning if I don't help you make that happen and let you know that this is what you need to do. And I'm like, fork, pancake. You know what I mean? Like, it was like this crazy thing. But so much has changed because I took him up on that. God spoke through him, and then here we are. It's a wild thing. It was like a before and after hinge moment of life. Another one of my hinge moments in life was painful. Back in 2015 in August, my dad passed away, 61 years old. And he had been unwell for a long time, but man, the last couple days were so fast. And I remember being down in Carmel at the Heart Center and just thinking like, oh my gosh, like all of my life will be before and after this moment. It was tough. You see, that's the other reality of hinge moments is often in the hinge moments of our life, they're kind of a graceless moment where there's a gap. We don't know how it's going to be filled, and we don't know what's going to fill that gap between who we are and the monstrosity of life that we're facing. Oftentimes, they're shame-filled moments. They're graceless moments, these hinge moments. Sometimes they show up like isolation when we feel like we're all alone. Maybe it's from a life transition where you lost a job or your company shut down, and there's shame involved with that. There's embarrassment, and then you're like, what is happening next? It's like the floor underneath you has fallen through. Maybe for you it's in a relational moment where you never imagined being divorced, but here you are being served papers, and this life that you had dreamed of, man, it's not happening anymore. Maybe it's a loss of a friend or a family member who went way too soon, and you can't imagine what life looks like after it, and all you can think about is the beauty that happened before it. Maybe it's moving communities or moving to a new church. and you're just struggling from isolation where you feel all alone in it. Other times, when we make destructive decisions, what the scriptures might call sin, destructive decisions, things that harm us and harm others that God loves, we feel guilty about it. We feel like we're all alone in this, and we feel like, I can't believe I did that. I made such a mess out of things, and we end up becoming our own worst enemy, our own critic in that moment. We feel guilty. And other times, that guilt shifts into shame, to where we don't think we just did something bad. We think that we are something bad. And maybe shame happened in your life or in someone you know when something went public. They found themselves in the newspaper or on Facebook, or all the moms at school know about it, or all their kids' parents know about it that your kids hang out with. Your whole church community, it might just be that moment where you're like, I just want to hide in my room and never come out again. Those are those graceless hinge moments of life. And what I find to be so fascinating is if you follow around Jesus in the New Testament, you spend like 10 seconds following him around and what his followers wrote about him and their memories of him. And you see that Jesus ran towards these hinge moments. Like, there are so many examples. Like, at one point this week in my studies, I had like 12 different texts I could take us to where Jesus met people in their hinge moment. Don't worry, we're only going to do 2. But I still ran long in the first service, so don't worry. But this is what Jesus did. He ran towards people in their hinge moments where there was guilt and shame and isolation, and he ran in to dispense the power and the presence and the posture of God of grace in those moments. I want to take us to a couple of those to see what we can learn from it today. First, we're going to be in Luke chapter 8. Jesus and his disciples are on the way to actually heal one of the religious leaders' kids in the community had been stricken with illness. And Jesus is on the way to perform some kind of healing. And there's a huge crowd around Jesus. We'll pick up here in Luke chapter 8. As Jesus was on his way, the crowds almost crushed him. Imagine you're leaving Gainbridge Fieldhouse this afternoon as the Pacers take down them in game 4. I mean, that would just feel so great, right? Sorry, that's just where half my mind is. And a woman was there in this crushing crowd who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years, but no one could heal her. Now, this is not a woman who just needed a new Band-Aid. This is a woman who had been suffering from bleeding for most of her life. And blood is a huge deal to this ancient culture because if you were someone who was bleeding in any way, shape, or form, you were ceremonially unclean and you needed to be isolated from people. She's in a crowd. Because if you touched anybody, then they were ceremonially unclean as well. And if you had an illness of bleeding that had been going on for years, the cultural narrative was that you did something wrong and God is punishing you. And so you need to stay away from people. You couldn't participate in worship and go to temple. You couldn't go to participate in commerce and be in the marketplace. You couldn't, of course, there's nobody that would want to like court you or marry you or have a family with you. You were on your own, isolated forever. This was your lot in life. There's a woman who's been bleeding for 12 years. We're told that no one could heal her. Other texts tell us that she had spent all of her money on doctors and doctors just made it worse. She felt hopeless. But she heard that Jesus was coming through town, so this was her one shot. We're told this next. She came up behind him, behind Jesus, and touched the edge of his cloak. This was like her thinking of like, this is a sneak attack. I'm not going to make a big scene. I'm just going to go touch the edge of his cloak. And then this whole thing's, if he's really the Messiah, this whole thing's going to be over with. He'll never know about it. Now, the edge of his cloak, it's actually what Jewish men during this time had prayer shawls. And there were these tassels that hung underneath of their robe called tzitzis. And these tzitzis is what she reached out and touched in this moment. And immediately her bleeding stopped. The sneak attack on Jesus actually worked. Her bleeding stopped, a miracle in this moment. And she thought that she would just sort of slip out of the crowd, do like those like silent, like that kind of a thing, but not to make a scene at all. She's going to slip out of there. But Jesus was having none of it. Jesus says, "Who touched me?" He asked. When they all denied it, Peter said, come on, Jesus, Master, the people are crowding and pressing against you. Everybody is touching you. What are you talking about? But Jesus would not let it go. Jesus said, someone touched me. I know that power has gone out from me. Jesus knows that he was touched by a bunch of people, but he wanted to mark this moment. He senses a hinge moment, a pivot point moment for somebody. And he sees the crowd around him. Here's an opportunity to put the character and the heart of God on display for all of these people. And he's not going to stop. Things are getting awkward now because the whole crowd stops and Jesus is waiting for someone to step forward. We're told this in the very next verse. Then the woman, seeing that she could not go unnoticed, came trembling and fell at his feet. In the presence of all the people, she told why she had touched him and how she had been instantly healed. Why is this woman falling and trembling at the feet of Jesus? Because she's terrified, because she did a big cultural no-no. She wasn't supposed to be in a crowd at all. I mean, imagine, she's been bleeding for 12 years. Her clothes are stained with blood. People are going to see what was going on. And she's like, I'm going to get this stern talking to. Jesus is going to be like, woman, what are you doing? I was on my way to go heal a child, and you interrupted me, and now you've made me ceremonially unclean. Now I need to go away for a couple days and go through the purification rites. What are you talking about, woman? And she's thinking about all the people around her that are now thinking that they were touched by this woman too, and they're going to be inconvenienced, and there's just going to be a shame party in this moment. What is going to happen? She told her story, and she comes forward. She's trembling. What's Jesus going to do? Jesus meets her in this hinge moment where there's guilt and shame and the promise of more isolation, and he dispenses grace. We're told this. Then he said to her, Jesus said, daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace. Daughter, not woman, not ma'am or lady, it's daughter. It's a word that's used for familiarity. It's you're close. This is intimate language here that you were on your own, you were isolated, but you are now a daughter. This is who you are. Jesus says, your faith has healed you. This was not just a desperate woman, my friends. This was a woman who knew her text and believed that Jesus was the Messiah. Malachi in the Old Testament, chapter 4, verse 2, it says that the Messiah would come with healing in his wings. She believed that Jesus was the Messiah. And what were these tassels called that rabbis had? It was called their wings. She reached out and touched his wings because she believed he was the Messiah, and that's where healing was coming from. And Jesus honors her faith, saying, yeah, your faith has healed you. And then Jesus says, go in peace. This is not like later, deuces. This is, let shalom guide you. Your life that was once chaos and isolation and guilt and shame, let it be restored. Jesus met this desperate, faith-filled woman in her moment, her hinge moment, with grace and compassion and a welcome. Another account, Luke chapter 19. Jesus is traveling through Jericho, and we meet a wee little man. And if anybody giggled at that, you grew up in conservative Sunday school with flannel graph and puppets, and God bless you. You have less to deconstruct later in your life. Anyway, this is where the text takes us. Luke chapter 19. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. Jericho was a wealthy part of Israel, and it's where the Roman Empire had set up some of their headquarters. And we see there's a chief tax collector there by the name of Zacchaeus. Now, he is very wealthy. He's the top of the food chain of tax collectors. And tax collectors, again, are not just IRS agents who come and take some of our money every April. It's not that at all. These are people that were actually Jewish men who had been disavowed from their heritage and from their community, and they disavowed their identity as a Jewish man, and they went to work for Rome and rip off and extort the Jewish people. And this is someone who rose to the very top doing it. Somebody who was a traitor of God's people and got loaded in the process. We're told this next. He wanted to see who Jesus was. He had heard about Jesus. And listen, guys, Jesus is irresistible to those on the outside. Like, he had to see, it sounds too good to be true. Could it be true that this is what God in human form is like? This is what the Messiah is like? This is what the coming king to restore the kingdom, this is what he's like? He's drawn to Jesus. But we're told this detail that I'm sure Zacchaeus once left out of the text forever. But because he was short and could not see over the crowd, a wee little man was he. So he ran ahead and he climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him since Jesus was coming his way. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but he didn't want to be like participating in the parade, that he wanted to be an observer. He knew that he was disliked and he had lost all of his identity as a Jewish man. He's like, I just want to see this Jesus. I just got to get an idea of what he's like. And so he climbs up a sycamore fig tree and does the work to get a good angle right around turn 3 where he can see everything perfectly. It's an interesting thing I learned this week that in the Jewish mind, a sycamore fig tree represents restoration and salvation. It's almost like God's tipping his hat about what's going to go down. Here's Zacchaeus wanting to see Jesus. He wants to be a spectator, and he's coming around the corner. He's there up in the fig tree. Jesus is coming around, and then we're told this next. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. And all the introverts in the room trembled. Come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. Even in the ancient world where hospitality was next to godliness, even rabbis never invited themselves over to other people's homes. They wanted to be invited to sit down in people's homes. Jesus is breaking another norm here. It's almost like Jesus' heart is on display in this moment where Jesus is compelled and drawn towards Zacchaeus, where he's got a million other things to do, but he's like, I've got to spend time with that dude up in the tree. I see that he's got shame and he's alone. And I want to spend time with him. I've got to come over to your house. I've got to sit at a table with you, Zacchaeus, is what Jesus was saying in this moment. It's a beautiful, beautiful moment that we see. And it's in this moment that grace is actually on display. Hear me, friends. Jesus' grace is on display long before he went to a cross to die for sins and to put it on display there. Jesus begins to dispense grace by saying, I want to spend time with you. Yes, you. Can we have a meal together? Can I come over and spend time with you? I know your background. I know your history. I see from your garb that you're a tax collector, and by the bling on your chain, you're pretty good at it. But I want to spend time with you. This was Jesus' grace on display. But the crowds didn't want to have anything to do with this. We're told this. All the people saw this and began to mutter. Oh, he's gone to be the guest of a sinner. Oh, this Jesus, I thought he was a pretty good teacher, but he's gone way too far. He'll just welcome anybody? What is this? This is not the way it's supposed to be. This upset people because Jesus, again, was bumping up against a cultural norm of table fellowship. This is not Torah, this is not Old Testament law, but it was some of the fences that people built up around the law to say that you're not even supposed to be under the same roof with someone who is a sinner. Someone who's not observant of the law, of the scum of the earth. Don't spend time with them. Never share a meal with them. Don't ever sit at a table with them. And Jesus saw that law and he said, whatever, I'm doing a new thing. And he dispenses grace to him. And in this moment, this is where everything begins to change for Zacchaeus. It's when Jesus invites himself over to spend time with him. And then we're told this. But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount. Now, on the surface, we can be really cynical, and we can see this, be like, okay, see, Zacchaeus is still trying to use his tax collector thing, trying to win the approval of Jesus and getting Jesus' good graces after all the wrong that he's done, but I don't think that's the case at all. I think Zacchaeus has experienced the grace of Jesus by this invitation to table fellowship. And then from there, he's now breathing out grace to the world around him. He's actually practicing grace because he's been transformed by grace. And he's looking around and now he's like, I see people that are poor. I see people that are suffering and I want to do something about that. So I'm going to give some of my fat stacks to them. And then he says, I'm going to pay back anybody that I wronged 4 times the amount. In the Old Testament law, that goes way beyond making amends. He's going way beyond. He's going over the top and lavishing grace and kindness through his generosity. This is somebody who has received the grace of God and now is breathing it back out on others. And Jesus sees this response of Zacchaeus receiving grace and then practicing grace. And this is what Jesus says, which is so beautiful. Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man, speaking of himself, came to seek and to save the lost. Jesus says, this man too is a son of Abraham, the one who had disavowed his heritage, disavowed his calling to be a child of the covenant, who everybody had forgotten and that he had given up that part of his life. Jesus restores his identity, saying that he is a son of the promise of the covenant. He is a son of Abraham. There is restoration and salvation that is occurring in this house today. Jesus met him in his hinge moment of isolation and shame. He says, here's grace. This is how I will respond in this moment. My friends, this is what Jesus does. And hear me, grace is not a one-way street. He is inviting you, yes, you, every one of us, to partner with him, to get into the beautiful, holy flow of grace being received and grace being breathed out. And it's best when we find it in these hinge moments of life, when we see things and people that are broken and we see them differently. Put it this way. For us, you guys, for us to participate in this grace flow to others, we've got to see others with grace-healed eyes. We've got to begin to put on lenses that Jesus would wear to see people more than just their sin, their mess, their brokenness. This is what Jesus did in this moment. He didn't just see a desperate woman who reached into the sneak attack miracle. He saw a woman who was suffering and a woman who had great faith. In that hinge moment, he met her with grace. This is what Jesus did to Zacchaeus when Zacchaeus was a chief tax collector, when he was somebody who had disavowed his heritage, disavowed his calling, disavowed his family, and been disavowed by everybody else. Jesus sees him in that shame and isolation, and he dispenses grace because he sees them as more than just their sin. Hear me. Somebody needs to hear this today. Your heavenly Father, when he sees you, he does not see simply a sinner. He doesn't see you as gross or evil or just a broken misfit toy. Your heavenly Father sees more. He says that you're good. Your heavenly Father speaks to you and says that you are good. And yes, there is sin, and yes, there is brokenness there, but that sin, that brokenness is the intruder into God's good story. It's not who you really are. And God's grace-healed eyes sees you for who you really are and invites you to take a step forward. And this is what we're called to do for others. Grace-healed eyes choose to be curious about people and not judgmental about people, to see beyond the brokenness on the shell, to see the actual hurt and pain underneath. An absent-minded waiter or waitress, a controlling boss, a critical friend. There's more going on underneath the surface than just the brokenness that's driving us crazy. And grace-healed eyes invite us to see that. We've all heard it said that everyone we come in contact with is carrying a heavy burden we know nothing about. May we have grace-healed eyes to see them for who God calls them to be, not just the brokenness on the surface. And then lastly, you and I, if we're going to be grace dispensers to give this irresistible grace to the world, we've got to disrupt something. We've got to disrupt shame with grace. This is our call. This is our challenge. This is part of our vocation, if you're here and you're a Christ follower, is to disrupt shame with grace. Because there is a cycle that needs to be disrupted. Here's the cycle in our culture. Destructive decisions happen. We harm ourselves. We harm other people. And that leads us to feeling guilty about it. And we sit long enough in our guilt, it slides into shame where we start to believe that this is just who I am. And in that shame, we don't move towards a community. We move away from people because of that shame. And we go to isolation, and we're all alone, just sort of rolling in our guilt and our shame, all alone. And what does that lead to? It leads to more destructive decisions. Come on. Hear me, if you're a follower of Jesus, you and I are called to disrupt this cycle. We're called to live by a better story, a truer story, a more beautiful story where we get in the middle of this and we say, this is not the truest thing about us or other people, so we disrupt the cycle. Grace dispensers don't pile on the guilt and shame. We disrupt it. We see people in their guilt and shame and isolation hinge moments, and we realize they already feel bad enough. They don't need another voice telling them that they're in the wrong. The most famous verse in all of the Bible, John 3:16, says this about Jesus. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. We forget often that there's a John 3:17 that keeps explaining Jesus' mission. It says this, for God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. My brothers and sisters, if God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, what makes you think that he sent you into the world to condemn the world? It's not our game. We're not going to compile and pile on the guilt and shame. We're going to disrupt it. Because that's what Jesus does for us. We disrupt the shame cycle, the isolation cycle, the guilt cycle with grace. About a year and a half ago, here at the church, there was a young college-age guy who started coming here, and he's here almost every Sunday. And after a while, like he came up, he's like, "Hey, man, I want to get baptized. I want to tell people that I want to follow Jesus. That I want him to be the leader of my life. Can I get baptized?" I'm like, "Yes, man, yes." So it was the next week. It was like Thursday. We had our fancy hog trough baptismal, all heated up. The water was all ready to go. And somebody shares a picture of him on that Howard County Busted Facebook page, you know, that where shame goes to like win supreme, you know. And he had been at a Halloween party, overdrank, got in a vehicle, got a DUI. And I'm like, oh, buddy, what were you thinking? You know, it was like one of those things. I'm like, and he's supposed to get baptized on Sunday, and what's going to happen now? Well, it was about 20 minutes later, he called me, which was an awesome, bold, grown-up move. He called me. Hey, man, I don't know if you saw. His voice was shaking. I don't know if you saw, but I idiot. I can't believe I did this, but I was at this Halloween party, and I was drinking, and he was underage, and then I drove my girlfriend home, and I'm so sorry. I don't know what I was thinking, and I don't know. I don't think I can get baptized on Sunday. I gotta figure this thing out. And man, I heard so much guilt and so much shame on the other end of that call. I remember thinking, like, what was he thinking I was going to respond to? How did he think this hinge moment was going to go? Was he expecting me to be like, yeah, man, you got to get it together. I mean, maybe you should read the Bible and write up a little book report, and maybe in 6 months we can revisit this if I see some improvement. Or I could be like, no, man, we're not going to let you do this at this church. We've got it together at this church. But man, I heard so much guilt and shame on the other end of the phone, and this is not like this is not me often, not as much as it should be, but like I just remember thinking like I wasn't going to pile on the guilt and shame in this phone call. I go, buddy, I love you, and I'm so proud of you. This was such a grown-up thing for you to call me and tell me this. But I also want you to hear this, that God loves you. God forgives you. And I think you should get baptized on Sunday if you want to get baptized on Sunday. Because God is the author of countless second chances. And what a more beautiful thing to celebrate than that on Sunday morning. So we got baptized on Sunday morning. And he was here at the 8:45 service this morning, but when you guys were still in bed. Grace is a two-way street. We're called to receive it and then breathe it out. May we be known as people who don't pile on guilt and shame, but disrupt guilt and shame with the power and the presence and the posture of God called grace. Who do you know that's in a hinge moment of their life right now, where that gap might be being filled in by isolation, guilt, and shame? And how can you distribute grace to them, dispense grace to them, disrupt their shame with grace this week? Only you can answer that question, but I pray that you'll decide to partner with him in that.